Welcome to a podcast about disciple making in the public square, where we talk about everyday issues from a biblical and balanced perspective. This is where life exists. This is where life exists, where we talk about everyday issues from a biblical and balanced perspective. My name is Hadi Lewis, lead pastor of Blueprint Church and vice president of the Sin Network, and I am here with Sho Baraka.
That is I.
That is it. Yes. My name is Hadi Baraka. This is Sho Baraka. So yes, we are brothers, blood brothers. So like that's always the questions. Like real like brother. Like
not like our brothers, like how black people say it.
Yeah, like no, like really brothers, and that's where we are. We are here.
We're all three brothers. We're brothers, and we're brothers in Christ.
Yes,
there you go.
I love that.
We cover it all.
We cover it all. So yes, so it's yes to all the questions about brothers.
Yes.
So you're brothers, brother. Okay, so that's good. And so basically, we're in this series, kind of where life exists, old stories, new voices. But today we're going to talk about, someone, my brother, who I respect dearly, who has taken a lot of different old stories, a lot of different things, and just kind of is amalgamizing those things into kind of his voice, a new voice. And he is actually going to be releasing a book, that's bringing all of that together.
No, yeah.
So how does that feel to I'm about to write a book?
I've always known that I wanted to write. So
Okay.
There's two things that I always wanted to do, I think, since I got to college. One was teach. I thought, I didn't know what level I wanted to teach. I wanted to, I was hoping the college level. Another thing I wanted to do was write. And as I got older, my affections actually grew towards writing fiction, and I wanted to write fiction. And but this book is not actually fiction. However, there are elements of fiction, short stories and poems, and you say like choreo poems and whatnot in there. But it's different from making music. For those people who know me, I've made music, and I've felt extremely confident about making music throughout the years. You produce something, you're like, I know the people will love this, or at least the people who follow me will love it. A book is something different because it's the first time you're establishing your voice through an academic sense, if you will, and you're wondering will I compare to all the voices that I love, the people that I read? It's nothing compared to them. Will the people even find me legitimate? And you have all these insecurities, but at the same time, you're writing, you're reading it back, or you're letting other people read it, and you're feeling somewhat confident at the same time. So there's this dance that you're participating in. So I will say the short answer is I have moments of extreme vulnerability and insecurity, and then I have moments of extreme excitement and confidence.
No, I love that because when I wrote my first, it was all just vulnerability. Yeah. Because all I remember in high school and middle school and elementary school is the red ink, run-on sentence.
Exactly, right.
Right. It's that's all I remember. So I was just writing, no. So I've always said to myself, I'm not gonna write, but I'm just gonna talk, and I can have as many whatever I want to have, and so. But
editors are the Holy Spirit. That's what they are.
Yes.
They're a gift from the Lord. And so there's oftentimes, I think you and I have similar, we probably write like we'd speak. Mm-hmm. And that's a dangerous thing for, it's not good. Yeah. And so as long as you put the idea and it's cognitive and, or it's cogent and it's it makes, then people will,
right.
they'll consume it.
Really, that's how, and that gets me in trouble because I was like, did you get my point?
Bottom line is does it make sense?
Does it make sense?
All right, then print it.
That's not good all the time. Right. But the book that you have is that he saw that it was good. I'm looking at it and referring to my phone because I just got the PDF.
You're welcome.
It's just so I appreciate it. I got the PDF. I'm looking at it. He saw this is good. You'll see the description in the title. It's going to be released in May 18th.
May 18th.
So that's when you're going to get a chance to get it. But now I get a chance to get it to look at it, and I'm excited. Give us an overview of the book, the heart, the passion, and tie it into kind of the series that I'm doing now, Old Stories, New Voices, and why are we talking about that today?
The book in general is, as you say, just a meeting or an intersection of all the things that I'm passionate about. So I love Jesus with all my heart, mind, body, and soul. I love creativity and in art and different forms of creative expression. And I love history. And so with that comes this idea of where does faith work, or creativity, justice, and the legacy of those folks who've come before me, where do they all meet, and how can I communicate stories and pull from individuals and movements in the past that have used their life to heal a broken world. So the tag is how to reimagine your creative life to heal or repair a broken world. And so there's some concepts and some principles in that book that I'm trying to unpack, but ultimately what I try to do is use anecdotes and just past stories in order to bring present truths to people that I think are struggling with some of the things of how does my faith inform how I interact in the space of justice, or how does it help me in the way that I work 9 to 5, and what does it mean for me as an individual who likes to participate in these types of things, but there's not a clear theology to help me with that. And I'm not saying I'm necessarily creating new theologies, I'm just trying to create a space for people to have larger discussions and say, why do we feel like these things aren't helpful? Has evangelicalism kind of created an edit that we need to remove? Are there restrictions that are good? Are there restrictions that are bad? And let's wrestle with those truths. But ultimately, we're all participating in creating culture in some way. Know that and know where you are and evaluate how we can either do that better or how we need to repent and repair.
All right, for those who are interested in the book, give us your table of contents, right?
All right.
Give us the chapter by chapter with the one sentence breakdown of each one, or a couple sentences of each one.
I may have to look at that PDF.
Okay.
Just off the top of my head, it obviously starts off with so there's a lot of shorts, stories, poems. So it starts off with a short called The Highest Divine. And I don't want to give too much, but it's how do we paint God is basically a general idea. It's like, how do you paint God? Then it goes into the introduction, which is kind of like all right, this is what the book's about, and this is how I'm gonna try to prove my point. The first chapter is, then goes into like this theology of story.
Okay.
Like why is story important to the formation of individuals, and how do we become who we are? And we receive that through tribes, through the transmission of tribes, through popular media, et cetera, just go on and so forth. And so therefore, these are the things that that makes our identity. I'm probably going to be missing some things, but then we go on to chapter 2. Now that we understand story and we understand how we view ourselves and how we view the world, how do those things create implications for how I work and how I create? And so now it's like a theology of work, if you will, that I'm trying to establish. And then there's a short story about where's prudence. It's about how different segments of our society have killed off wisdom. And then there's the third chapter, which is a survey of justice through creativity in the Black Christian legacy. So I walk from plantation to kind of like hip hop. And this is not an extensive, but it's just my way of showing that Black Christian tradition has never really been divorced from an idea of justice. And to say that, biblical justice has been intrinsically tied into what we believe as Christians because of our predicament in the United States, right? And so because of that, I try to, tell stories about, I talk about how the theology of our ancestors were both cognitive. It was something that we thought through. It was something that was very personal, but it was also corporal. It's a theology of body. It's a theology of community and how we interact in spaces. Moving on, fourth chapter is, though we have these ideas about justice, sometimes we disagree. And sometimes good ideas and bad ideas beat out vice versa. And even if it's not a bad idea, even if it's two good ideas, sometimes those ideas conflict with one another. I know you've done some interviews around Du Bois and Booker T, so it's very similar to that. There have been great theologies or ideologies and theologies that have conflicted with one another, and that doesn't mean that one is, necessarily deficient and the other one is healthy. It's just that people have different. We often talk about how Black people aren't a monolith throughout our society, but once somebody diverges from that, you call them Toms, you call them sellouts. And it's just unfair. And that has been a predicament throughout history. So I try to paint this, story through that in the fourth chapter. I'll try to move on. The fifth chapter, I talk about what does it mean to be an exile? From like the actual Exodus story, Jeremiah in Babylon, and then also what does that mean for us today? And I try to tie some movements throughout history and even through present day Christian hip hop, how being an exile or how being an orphan in particular spaces, mainly white evangelical space, and then what does it mean to reclaim and redeem, I guess you could say, black evangelicalism, and the tensions for that. The 6th chapter is probably the one that's gonna get me in the most trouble, is called Light Words and a Good Night. And it's basically my reason to cuss throughout the book, and also talk about how oftentimes our sanitizing of the world is not helpful for the Christian maturity and the Christian walk. And that's why a lot of our discipleship is putrid. It's not helpful. We try to distract youth with pizza and rap, but when they're really struggling with deeper and darker things, one of the arguments I make is that The Wire has taught me more than some sermons have taught me, because it's an honest depiction of the brokenness of the world. And oftentimes in Christianity we try to sanitize that. And then the last chapter is just a basic, I guess you could say, exploration of some points of how to be, I guess you could say, effective in this walk of the Christian faith through some of the principles that I've taught. And I've skipped some of the poems and short stories, but I think it's a helpful book. I'm excited about it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading it. May 18th is coming out. He saw that it was good, and so it's a creative depiction of it. But in light of this, we're talking about old stories, new voices, and and you talked about the exile. I want to dig in a little bit to that chapter, because I think it's prominent and relevant for our day today, right? About how we live as the exiled, and just the different tensions. How do you think that chapter, a little bit, without going into just the nature of like a deep dive and telling the book, because we want to get the book, but talk to us a little bit about that, about the chapter and how you see that it would be helpful for today. What's the problem that it's trying to solve?
Well, ultimately, the foundational truth is that we have to realize that we're orphans, and this is not our world. And so in a lot of ways, we had an opportunity to occupy a very perfect and holy space in the garden, but because of sin, that corrupted that. And all things have been corrupted. And in a lot of ways, it seems like we're trying to recreate some utopian society. And for all intents and purposes, that's impossible. Like, we can't recreate the garden, but we are a part of God's holistic, overarching, redemptive plan to try to make this particular like terrain which we live on more of a representation of the kingdom, right? But in that, we have to understand that we are orphans, and there is no space that is going to be perfectly fit for anybody, right? And so what I try to communicate is all right, so now that we know that we are orphans, in a larger narrative, how do we take that and apply it to Black people who are oftentimes feeling like they're exiled or they're orphaned in Christian spaces here in this country? And I use a couple narratives in Exodus, I use one from Jeremiah, and I also take some historical examples from Black history and movements through the 1930s, the Harlem Renaissance, Black evangelicalism explosion through like the late 50s, 60s, and 70s, and then today with Christian hip hop, and I try to create parallel examples for those things. But the one thing that I'll communicate that I think, the one principle that I try to I guess you could say exposit, if that's throughout the piece of comprehension that I try to give throughout the book is there's 4 points that I try to explain. Is like, one, that we can learn from the Exodus is that when God removes the Hebrew people from Egypt, the first thing he does is he gives them real liberation, like actual removing them from an oppressive space, right? So we need real liberation in the sense that there has been real slavery, there's been real oppressive systems and legislation that have kept people from participating in certain spaces, right? So in order to have true freedom and expression of that freedom, you need to be removed from that from that oppressive space. Then the second thing is that God establishes leadership. So once he removes like them, or he establishes leaderships to help with the liberation of his people, then he gives them law. And oftentimes what we want is we want liberation and we want to be free to roam, but God also wants us to obey particular principles. And so he gives law. But ultimately at the end, he does all that so that we can be people who worship him. He said, I have freed you so that you can worship me and to pass on these truths and this legacy so that your children and your generation. And I say all this to say that it's a very hard thing within our context, especially today, because sometimes we don't have the freedom to express the things we want to express, to create in the ways we want to create. Sometimes the leadership is not there to do those particular things. They don't have the courage to say and to make particular moves. The other thing is sometimes we want licentiousness, or we want freedom just to live a life that is apart from God's truths and his word. And then oftentimes we want a legacy that reflects us and not a legacy that reflects the desires of God and the heart of God. So there, you have leadership, you have liberation, you have law, and you have legacy. You know, a good pastor like yourself loves that alliteration, right? But ultimately, how does that look like? What does that look like for us in 2020 or 2021? I'm still stuck in 2020. Forgive me.
Yeah.
Let me leave.
2021 is the sequel.
So let me get to today. What does that look like today? All right. So one of the examples I try to flesh out is Black evangelicals in the 60s and 70s. There was a huge boom due to kind of like the burgeoning of like individuals like Tom Skinner and John Perkins, right? And you could throw other individuals like Crawford Loritz and some of these other folks who probably aren't as popular as them. And what was happening is they understood the identity affirmation that was given to them from Black Power movements and civil rights movement, right? But they also had this connection to evangelicalism that was true evangelicalism of, you know, the Bebington idea of not what evangelicalism is right now. And so the spaces that they created were mostly aligned similarly to, you know, I guess you can say to that of white evangelicals of that time. However, once they realized that they were more justice-oriented, and I'll just say that just for the sake of this conversation, those spaces became more suffocating for them. And then once they realized that they were becoming more suffocated, like they had no place to go.
Yeah.
You know, to digress a little bit, I forgot. One of the alliteration, it was land. So land. So God removes them from a space and gives them a land. So that's part of the Liberation Act. So now that people aren't just give people liberation and not give them a space to operate is futile, right? Like you need to be removed from oppression and given a space in order to be able to operate. And so when we think about Black evangelicals in the 50s and 60s, they were a part of a space. And I hate to call it Egypt, but that's, you know, to some degree they were part of Egypt. And then when they wanted to exit, they had leadership, they had ideas, they had vision, but there was no land. And if there was land, they didn't really establish it. They didn't create fertile ground for it to grow and it to live on. And if they did do it, they did it in the spaces that were mostly parachurch organizations. And those parachurch organizations, they in themselves were very connected to white evangelical resources. And so, not to babble on, because I want this to be a dialogue, the similarities that we see with the white evangelical spaces there, what we see with a lot of Christian hip hop movements, what I've come from, or a lot, what we see from the Christian hip hop movement, what I saw a large part of my formation, and shockingly, what we see with the Harlem Renaissance, which I use in the book, is that you have these great social ideas, you have these great talents and these people who are spokespersons for ideas and movements. However, they're often closely tied to people who have the ownership of the land or the ability for it to actually become more than just a social idea, to become an economic engine and a lifelong institution that can create real legacy. Yeah. And so, for instance, when we look at some of the great minds and individuals from those evangelical, booms in the 60s and 70s, hardly any of those individuals have any real strong institutions today. Yeah. And the same thing I'm trying to make for us today as Black evangelicals, if I can call us that, and Christian hip hop movement is, we have lots of great social ideas. We have good theology that we can change the world with, but do we have economic structures? Do we have land? Do we have spaces that we can pass on and give legacy to other people who come behind us? Because if we don't, we'll be just like the Harlem Renaissance, who were ran by, communists and white liberals who were funding these ideas, and as soon as they got disinterested, they removed their funding and their money, and so now those individuals like Zora Neale Hurston died broke. Those institutions in Harlem, the theaters that they even did most of their stuff out of, were owned by white folks. So where did they have, So here's a perpetuating story and issue that today we have to deal with. Where's our land? Where's our legacy? And where's our liberation? You know what I mean? So I believe we do have liberation. We have the freedom to do it. We have the leadership, but we're missing the land. We're missing the legacy piece.
Then that's what I was gonna ask. Like, is there a clearing call? In the book because a lot of times, in these days that there's a lot of like anti-vision. Right? What's wrong? What's problem? But the question is there a vision? Like what would you say you're calling us to do? Like,
there's two things that I would say that I'm calling us to do in the chapter 4 and chapter 5 is one, we have to stop saying that black people are diverse and then not acting on that maxim, right? We have to actually say it and then believe it. So then when somebody has a differing philosophy, how do we support that individual, right? The other thing is that we need real support and partnership. Like, we say we want other people to succeed, but there's a problem when there's always these competing organizations that come up, and it seems like we don't have, especially in the subgenre or the subculture of black evangelicals, there's not enough wealth, there's not enough firepower for us to have 5 fragmented institutions that are doing the same thing. We need one real strong one or two, right? That in order for us to get to a place where people can start actually building real wealth, social power, economic power, and political power to really do some damage. And the more we're fragmented, the more we're continuing to point fingers and calling people names, this is not going to be beneficial. And in 50 years from now, we're going to be in the same predicament where there's a fascist government that's trying to, and we're complaining like, oh, we need free space, we need our space, we need this, we need that. And it's like, well, we could have dealt with this 50 years ago, right? But we're too busy trying to find out who is the most talented to do this, or what person should have this platform. And so one, understanding we're different, acting out on that difference in a sense that it's affirming the difference, and then trying to figure out how we can come together and actually create coalitions, real financial support, real institutions that can really actually, and not just for the sake of being separatists, but for the purpose of creating real legitimate legacy, right? And the other thing is how do we stay or leave well? Like, if there are people who want to exist in the palace, how do you exist in the palace well like a Daniel or a Joseph? But if you want to exit, if you want to completely leave the palace, how do we leave the palace well and yet and still understanding that we're all part of the same body and family of God, that we're trying to build a kingdom that is otherworldly?
Yeah, that's really good. And I love that, what you're talking about, the idea of the diversity that we have in expression. How do we stay well or how do we leave well? But the idea is doing it well and honoring God. And then I love the second one, how do we create infrastructures and true partnership to leave a legacy that my kids will be able to benefit from the fruit of. And I think absolutely. That it's a lot of us, some of us, we got to get out of our American mindset, meaning that I'm only looking for the here and now, and I'm looking for a future that I will never experience. And a lot of times that's what Abraham, that's what Moses, like they lived their life, to bring the people to a future that they would not ever get a chance to live or experience.
And so one of the things I try to talk about, and I'll give shout out to Jeff Wright, president of UMI. We talk a lot, and I kind of consider him like a distant mentor, if you will. But he has this idea of like a palace theology, if you will, or a palace mindset. And we all have to understand that we're privileged in a way that we have resources and we're connected to palaces. And while you're in the palace, the beautiful thing about every story in the scripture is that those individuals who are in the palace were not there for their own success and their own benefit. They were there for the flourishing of other people. Look at Esther, right? How can I use my status and my platform to save other people? Look at Joseph. It seems like he was quite selfish, but at the end, he used that for the blessing of his family and the whole nation, right? Look at Daniel. You look at so many examples, and Jesus is the ultimate example of that, right? I created this palace. I've come here to give the people who are actually going to persecute me an opportunity to find redemption and love and forgiveness, right? And so no matter what position, you are in a palace. And, you know, and some people may mock you and ridicule you for the palace you're in, but if I know you to be the individual that I know, you're using that position for the benefit of other people. And what I would say is the folks who are outside the palace, ready to storm it, will understand why Dhati's in the palace. And Dhati, you have to understand why there are people outside who want to storm the palace, you know what I'm saying? And how do we create, if you're going to be Nehemiah, if you're going to leave and say, look, I need to go home, I need to go and build. Well, let's do that, but how do we do that well and not ridicule Nehemiah, and Nehemiah's not ridiculing Daniel? And so it's like, look, there are people who are going to stay and there are people who are going to exit.
That's good. That's good. Man, so much we could continue to talk about, and this is where life exists, where we talk about everyday issues from a biblical and balanced perspective. I am with Sho Baraka, and
the book is Sho Baraka. So if you go looking for the book, it's Sho Baraka.
It's Sho Baraka, and it is.
He saw that it was good.
He saw that it was good, and it's coming out May 18th. So I'm excited. Thank you for being on the show, sir.
Boom. Appreciate you for having me.
Peace. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Where Life Exists. Today, I hope you were as encouraged and challenged as I was. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with our newest videos. And if you have any old stories you'd like for us to share about, be sure to leave a comment below.